Hello and welcome to another episode of Chai, Children of Adam and Eve on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan of Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue during the month of Ramadan, where we discuss research relevant to our lives today. Professor Radha Dallal is Assistant Professor of Islamic Art and Architecture in the Art History program at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar. She researches visual cultures of mobility with a particular emphasis on the Ottoman Empire in the 19th and 20th centuries and its socio-political interactions with other European and Asian polities. Her forthcoming monograph, called At the Crossroads of Modernity, Space and Identity, explores evocations of loss, nostalgia and communitas in the visual and literary intersections of Istanbul and the Orient Express train. Her projects include an examination of visual propaganda of the Khilafat movement in India with the larger context of Ottoman pan-Islamic narratives, a close reading of the Panorama 1453 History Museum in Istanbul within the current political context of Turkey, and the intertextual relationship between Ottoman photography and the production of picture postcards in late 19th century Istanbul. Welcome to the studio, Radha.
Thank you for having me.
Well, if we can begin with, what do you mean when you use the term visual cultures of mobility?
That's a good question. In studying visual culture in general, we tend to be looking at object and the creation of peoples as being static, as being rooted to a particular locale. In my research, I've been interested in seeing much more the movement of ideas, the movement of peoples, and the movement of objects through a visual lens, trying to understand, how cross-cultural influences allow for a better understanding of, the physical and contextual dimensions of objects. And so that's what I really mean by visual cultures of mobility.
But would you say that style travels while aesthetics do not?
From the perspective of art history, the two have very different meaning. When we talk about style, we're referring to, for example, if you take a painting, the manner that a painting is done in. And in that sense, it's very much possible for style to travel. So you could have, the style of Rembrandt travel, from Europe to another region. In terms of aesthetics, we're really looking at sort of the philosophical roots of beauty. What is art? What is natural beauty versus artificial beauty and what have you. And so in that sense, we're looking at a much more philosophical construct behind the study of art. In that sense as well, there are instances in the history of the world where you do see certain kinds of aesthetics moving, much more temporally, I would say, than geographically. So, for example, in the Renaissance period, the emergence of this sort of, neoclassicism coming from, the aesthetics developed during the classical period in Rome and Greece. I think, that would be one example of where aesthetics do travel. But again, it depends on how you're qualifying the terms. And where you're applying them.
Perhaps another way of asking the question is, do we see differently in different contexts and times?
Looking is a very personal mode of engaging with the world. And I think that in that sense, yes, we do. We do look at things differently. We tend to very much look at things and perceive things based on our own background, and that is cultural, that's political, that's socioeconomic. And so in that sense, no two people are going to look at the same thing in the same way. However, we're also discussing, in art history especially, not only the perception of the viewer, but also the intent of the creator. And so there's always going to be this sense of dialogue between the two, and that's essentially what we try to capture.
How does one go about as a historian of aesthetic to uncover an aesthetics of the past?
Okay, well, I'll qualify that first and say that I wouldn't consider myself a historian of aesthetics. I consider myself an art historian. And so for me, it is much more about the objects. It is much more about architecture, painting, ceramics, and different media. And going back to the question, how do we try to uncover this? We're looking at it from very different perspectives. We look at the formal characteristics of these objects, which boils down to simple things like line, space, color, composition. And then we move on to the contextual aspect of the objects. What are these objects or edifices trying to tell us about the past, about the cultures that created them, about the peoples that created them? What can we glean about that time period? And how does that have an impact on our culture today? So I think it's very much possible to engage with objects and artifacts in that sense.
Is it possible in a context like a museum to educate people about how particular objects were experienced or used in the past?
Absolutely. I think museums are a wonderful forum to have the public engage with elements of the past. Museums tend to have, for the most part, a didactic purpose. And they create exhibitions where either objects are placed together because they have stylistic similarities, or they come from a particular geographic region, or they can be placed in a way that allows the public to interact with them as people would have in the past. And so there are multiple dimensions to how an exhibit can really inform the public about the creative endeavors of humans in the past.
But this is still an exercise at some level in speculation about the past when it comes to giving an account of how really people did see or perceive or create, or the intent to create an object.
Perhaps to a degree there is speculation, but I would not say that the entire exercise is speculative. One of the things that art historians do that's very different from other historians is we look at the visual as a document. So it is not just about having, the text there to tell you more about that particular object, but to look, at the object itself, to read the object itself to give us more information. And then when we contextualize it, we look at all the other resources of evidence available. So we're looking at documents, we're looking at texts, we're looking at the information available on the way people lived at the time. We're looking at other kinds of art objects. And I think in that sense, we're able to really see the object in a fuller sense, to get a better picture of it, as it was used in that time period. And of course, it is always an evolving exercise, so that, we're never 100% comfortable with everything that we come up with, but we do revisit the same objects again to understand them better. And so I think in that sense, it's not an entirely speculative exercise, although there are times when you do have to speculate, I guess, on certain aspects, of the work.
You mentioned the didactic purpose of museums. Can they also be used to inform and make people aware of, for example, the prejudices that they might have in viewing their contemporaries?
Absolutely. I think that especially in the context of Western and Eastern relationships, given the political climate of the present, one of the things that has been quite rewarding for museal institutions in both Europe and the United States is to have exhibitions related to, say, Islamic culture, or cultures of East Asia or South Asia, where the museum plays a huge role in informing the public of the reality or the actuality of these religions and cultures, in contrast to the sort of preconceived notions or the media-based awareness that the general public tends to have. And I think they've been quite successful in getting the message across. So there is a way to try to diffuse some of the contemporary political tensions through the use of museums and the display of objects in museums. Yeah.
You're listening to Chai, Children of Adam and Eve on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan, where we are discussing today art history with Professor Radha Dalal. So going now towards your monograph, what is it in your monograph which links the East and the West other than the train?
When I talk about cultural mobilities, I am looking at both the literal mobility, which takes place, through actual physical movement. In the case of my study, it would be related to the train itself, moving from a European metropole, so either London or Paris, and going to its destination, Istanbul. But I'm also looking at metaphorical mobilities in the sense of the center and the periphery, the conception of the East and the West and its reception in the East, and vice versa. There's actually a very interesting book that came out in 2010 by Stephen Greenblatt called Cultural Mobilities, a Manifesto. And one of the things that he also refers to is, the difference between faith and skepticism. And it's through the lens of railway mobility that I'm really interested in looking at the negotiations of cultural attitudes and how one culture is influenced, by the development of another culture or the perceived, staticness, if I may say that, of another culture. And so through the train, I'm specifically looking at the imagery revolving around the train, so its brochures and its postcards and its posters, and how that creates an image of the city of Istanbul and its people, in contrast to the modernizing metropolis and the thriving metropolis that Istanbul was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm also looking at travelers from Istanbul who are Ottoman subjects who are traveling on the train going west and their perceptions of how the West sees them and also how they see the West. I'm looking at the use of the train in contemporary media, especially in video games, and how the train is seen as a marker of exoticism. And especially in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, when Istanbul is going through, quite a bit of political upheaval, the transition from the Ottoman Caliphate, to a secular Turkish Republic, you're also beginning to see Istanbul emerge as a location where crime has increased. Its identity has changed from being the capital of an empire to a subsidiary, of the new capital, Ankara. So it is a cultural capital in a way, but it no longer has its political identity, intact. And so, how are these identities of this particular city, negotiated in contemporary media? So that is one other angle that I look at. And then lastly, I'm interested in the train stations, especially the train station that received the Orient Express in Istanbul, Sirkeci railway station. And its emblematic presence in the capital of Istanbul as not only the harbinger of, technology, sort of new technologies coming into the Ottoman Empire, but also something that is emanating from the Sultanate itself. That, this is an Ottoman endeavor, that, there is a synergy between Islam and science and technology, and the train, is a symbol of that particular synergy. So I look at the train station, and then I investigate the train stations in the Hijaz, for example, in Medina and in Mecca, and see similarities in the construction and the style. That's one area where style travels. And you can see that there is this concerted effort on the part of the Ottomans to visually broadcast their sovereignty in the peripheries of their empire.
Just one last question. Your use of the term communitas, is that from Victor Turner? Because I have an interest in anthropology, so I was curious about how you use the term for
Yes,
your work.
it absolutely is from Victor Turner's work. And I refer to communitas in contemporary celebrations at the train station in Istanbul when the annual Orient Express comes in today. It's a nostalgic version, but I'm referring to the rituals that take place within the train station and how it involves the local population as well as the European tourists coming in.
Great. Thank you for your time today, Professor Radha. And we wish all our listeners Ramadan Kareem. And since this is our last program of the series, we also wish you Eid Mubarak. Thank you, Radha. Would you like to wish our listeners as well for the greetings?
Absolutely. Ramadan Kareem and Eid Mubarak. And thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
A special thanks to Ehab Al-Sheikh for bringing this program to you. And with this, a parting greeting of Eid Mubarak again, and may you all have a joyous holiday. Ma salam and goodbye.